There is no audio. I just got the message that there is no audio. I mute my microphone and I've been speaking. And that means that I have to start everything I've said over again. So if you can hear me now, okay. I'm on WhatsApp now. I'm looking at your messages on WhatsApp to understand that you can now hear me. So I will recap everything that I have said earlier. It is one of those things. Please bear with me. It's one advantage about this is that I can edit those areas out before we publish it on the YouTube. So those errors I've made in the beginning can be edited. Now, what I was saying earlier was that we started our governance subsection on section 3 of the new CIA syllabus. We started last week. So I'm just trying to help people to understand that we have gone past, we have had some discussions before now. You might not be able to look at those discussions, but the most important thing is that you need to understand that we had a discussion about governance. I think there are 3 items on governance. We have discussed the first item. So the only item the items we want to discuss is the item 2 and 3. And I would like to show you what I mean by those items, just for the people that will be watching this later. So this is what I was talking about. When we started, we spoke about this, and I hope you can see my screen. If you can see my screen, please send me a chat on WhatsApp, at least to confirm that I am on the right path. Like I said earlier, I am not used to this platform. Please, I want to be sure that you can see my screen. I just need somebody to send me a chat on the WhatsApp platform that you can see my screen. Thank you very much, Victoria. If one person can see my screen, I believe every other person watching can see my screen. And I want you to also confirm that it is only my screen that you can see, my presentation that you can see, and maybe my picture, but I'm not sure if that one is showing. Just confirm before I move on. I know my camera is on, so I want to be sure if you are seeing my camera or not. Just confirm quickly before I move on. So I'm checking that. I know somebody responded. Okay, somebody seeing only my face and not my presentation. Okay, let me try something again. We can cut all of these parts out, don't worry. What about now? Can you see? Because I'm switching between presentation slide. What about now? Can you see my presentation? I'm sorry for these hiccups. Please, I need somebody to what about? Okay, only myself now. Okay. Okay, let me now try again. Let me try again. I can also see we have 12 participants in the session. So let me try again. Just forgive me for these issues. We'll get there soon. Don't worry, we will be there. Okay. And now I will try again. I am learning on the job today. So I can now try to share PowerPoint slideshow. I can share now. Now I need somebody to can see my presentation properly. And I'm not getting any feedback from you. Okay, just hold on. I think I'm seeing some updates on the WhatsApp. Okay, somebody said it's clear now, good now, so I can return back to the. Okay, I'm waiting for that person chatting. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So I returned back to the main screen. So I'll have to go back to the actual place. I was. You're all welcome once again. this is where we treated this last week. For the people who will be watching this again, we only spoke about this area to go back to that again. But now we have that this is actual section 3. It's not section 2. It's an error. Please for that. It's an error. So and I will even like to correct this because of people that will be watching again. Don't worry, I can easily correct that so that anybody watching what we are doing, I can just drop the presentation, then edit that presentation slide, end that presentation, then make it three, three, then save, then we can start all over again. It's one of those things, and I'm getting used to uh, things like this now. Just a minute, I'm coming. So I want to be sure that I'm only having things that are necessary for now on my PC, so that I will reduce disruptions or distractions. So I just need a few things to work with for now. Okay, we have 15 people now. You are all welcome once again. So now I can share screen. Then I will go back to the live streaming. Then I can share it. I want to share this window there. So, and I now need you to confirm if you can see my screen properly on WhatsApp chats. I need I need somebody to just send a chat now before I move on. Okay. The current time is 11:17 Nigerian time. So the last chat I received was on 11:15. Please, I need one of you, if you can hear me, to send a chat to be sure. Okay, now visible. Thank you very much. I can go back to where we are. So I can see myself, but I can't see myself the presentation. So let us move on. Now, this is the section 3 of the new syllabus, the 2025 CIA Part 1 syllabus on international foundations. Please, we have discussed aspects of governance last week. I'm still receiving some charts, and I want to be sure that everybody is with me on this. Okay, thank you very much. So, we have spoken about this what we are going to be discussing today. Um, the syllabus requires the impact of organizational culture on the overall environment and individual engagement risk and controls. This is not limited to defining organizational culture and the control environment. So we are going to talk about culture, then talk about control environment, then defining engagement risk and controls. Possibly we will discuss some examples of engagement risk and controls. Then we are required to recognize the impact of the organization's decision-making processes on the organization's governance, risk management, and control processes. As much as I don't know what these are streamed to be long, just as you know me, I'm going to take my time trying to give my best to everyone watching or listening. Thank you very much for your patience, and let us start with governance. So, when we talk A plus B equals sure. So we are talking about A means attitude, B means behavior. So when you combine attitude and attitude and behavior together, you get culture. Then there's another thing that I want to add to that theory, I want to add practices to it. So, organizational culture is the collective set of shared values. Now, as a CI candidate, you need to pay attention to key points. So, I just want to mention, fine, we can see the definition here. I just want to mention the key words that should resonate when you are engaging in matters that relate to culture, organizational culture, shared values, beliefs, norms, assumptions, and practices. So when you add attitudes, behavior, beliefs, norms, assumptions, and practices together, they give us organizational culture. So it refers to the collective set of shared values, beliefs, attitudes, norms, assumptions, and practices that shape the behavior, the relationship, the interactions, the attitudes of stakeholders within an entity. So, organizational culture serve as an invisible framework guiding guiding stakeholders. For example, employees guiding stakeholders approach in guiding stakeholders approaches to how they do the work, how they make decisions, how they relate to one another, whether at the top level or at the low level, how they relate to other stakeholders like clients, regulators, and every other community, the entities neighbor, things like that. So it's a lot of intangible aspects of every organizations, and I would say one of the most areas that people don't pay attention to in organizational failure is culture. Like I said earlier on, I will say it again in Nigerian parlance. Culture is how we do things here. It is not about the set of general standards that have been set or customized standard that has been set within the organization. It is how we do it. So it doesn't rely on what we write down as our, let's say, shared values or our core values. It is much more about how things are done, the attitudes that people put into executing strategies, performing operations, and getting results. So it consists of the organization's core values, which shape everyday behavior within the entity. It is the actual value that we can say the employees or the stakeholders accept or reflects or displays or embodies. It is much more than the desired values. It is not about what we desire, it is about what we do and how we do it. It also includes the assumptions and the norms that dictate how we execute strategies, goals, objectives, and it also influence our behavior. So most times, failures, organizational failures are as a result of assumptions, norms, attitudes, beliefs, practices, behaviors at the end of the day. So it varies across different entity. So the kind of culture that you will have in entity A is different from the kind of culture you should be expecting in entity B. So it encompasses what we call ethical environment, ethical climate, ethical atmosphere, and also the standards that affect all aspects of organizational behavior, organizational operations, organizational activities, and things like that. So it is beyond the prescribed core values, standards, code of ethical behavior, regulations, laws, or practices that apply to every other or applies equally to every other organization. This one is unique to the organization. Now, another aspect that we also look at is the uh, key components. The key components, artifacts, espoused values, and underlying assumptions. What are the visible elements we can see when we join the organization? I remember when I joined bank in those days, they gave us some information about dress codes. What we can wear on Monday, what we should wear on Tuesday and Wednesday, and what we should wear on Friday. In a Nigeria environment, we're expected to dress corporate or formally from Monday to Tuesday. Then in some organizations, I think back then we have a uniform that we wear on Wednesdays. Then on Friday we wear our traditional attires. Then we can wear our jeans and trainers, things like that. And what we can combine the colors, office layout, symbols and rituals, things like that within the organization. So espouse values, core values, stated goals, mission, vision, mission statement, declare ethical standards, business code of ethics, things like that. Underlying assumptions, unconscious ingrained beliefs that drive behavior, which we'll talk about some examples. Maybe we'll find some examples when we move on. Then characteristics of organizational culture now, learned and socialized. It can be transmitted through onboarding. We have this onboarding where we join new organizations, storytelling, traditions, leadership. This is how we do it. Leadership by example. For example, I have worked in a place where the MD CEO, we care less about sanction, because the regulatory sanction is minimal, the cost is minimal. So the leader can actually rationalize making more money over following the laws or regulation. So what do you think that tells the lower people? So once they know, they can also do things like that to achieve their own target. And finally, influence now. Leaders model and reinforce cultural norms through actions and policies. And I'm not going to talk about only actions now. I'm saying actions in action, what they do and what the things that decide not to do. Sometimes people can decide not to do the right thing. They can decide not to. So the actions and the inactions too can be added to it. Then performance. A strong aligned culture fosters cohesion and goal attainment, while a misaligned or toxic culture can hinder productivity and morale. Sometimes if you work in some environment, your growth will be retarded because of the kind of culture in that environment. And if you find yourself as an internal auditor in an environment where the internal auditor cannot say it the way it is, then it can hinder the effectiveness and the quality of internal auditors' work. So every culture affects what we do as internal auditors. So to summarize all of this, we should understand that organizational culture is the personality of the entity, is the personality of the organization. It reflects both tangible practices and intangible ethos, belief system, behavior, attitudes. One thing you must understand as a CIA candidate is that senior management is mainly responsible for creating and upholding the organization's culture. And why? Why not the board? I will just say it is because the board is not part, although the board has responsibility in organizational governance, but because the board is not involved in day-to-day execution of activities towards the achievement of the organization's objectives, we can easily say that the senior management is responsible for creating and upholding the organization's culture. Fine, it has been established, placed in core values, and pasted on the boards or the organization website and the likes, but the management is responsible for creating and upholding it. Now, control environment. One of the things that I've been saying about the CIA certification content is that you will always meet the same principle in different places, and they will always mean the same thing, but we can use them to establish another thing entirely. Now, when you look at the Global Internal Audit Standards 2024, I don't know, based on my own review, I didn't see a definition of control environment there. Three in the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing. So to find a definition for appropriate definition that we can use for our discussion today. So according to the 2017 IPPF glossary that defines control environment as the attitude and actions. So apart from the behavioral beliefs that I said earlier on, I also added practices earlier. We can add actions and inactions to it. So the attitude and actions of the board and management regarding the importance of control within the organization. If the board and the senior management feel control is not important, that is the culture, that is the control environment, that is the way they are doing their things there. How we do it here is that our control, internal control, is not as important as the internal auditors are making it to be. So the control environment provides the discipline and structure for the achievement of the primary objectives of the system of internal control. What are the primary objectives of the system of internal control? According to COSO, you will find operating objectives, reporting objectives, and the compliance objectives. I'm talking about effectiveness and efficiency of operations, reliability, the accuracy, integrity, and reliability of information of reporting, then adherence to regulatory requirements, laws, legislation, and things like that. So the control environment includes matters such as integrity and ethical values. As a CI candidate, when you hear integrity and ethical values, when you hear culture, the next thing that should resonate in your mind should be, we are still talking about governance. Management philosophy and operating style, we are still talking about governance. Organizational structure, assignment of authority and responsibility, human resource policies and practices, competence of personnel. All of these are aspects of control environment, and they are all aspects of our governance. If you remember, the last time when we discussed governance, we discussed about initiatives that overlap in governance. We also discussed the relationship between governance, risk management, and control, if you remember very well. So you will discover that there are things that are here that are, you can find them in governance consent that we discussed, and also you can also find them in risk management. So now let's look at the definition by COSO. The COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework 2013 defines control environment as the set of standards, processes, and structures that provide the basis for carrying out internal control across the organization. Now, the set of standards, we can find set of standards where what are code of business conduct, philosophy, operation style, processes for human resources, policies, and things like that. We can link this definition to this definition by the IPPF 2017's on control environment. Now, let's look at generally what the COSO says about control. The first thing we must accept is that control environment is the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework 2013. It's set of the organization's internal control system. And it is the control environment that influences the control consciousness of the stakeholders. Like we said in the previous definition, it establishes the discipline and structure for all other components of internal control according to COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework 2013. The other components of internal control according to that framework is risk assessment, control activities, and information and communication, and the monetary activities. I can hear some charts on the. Okay, I'm still receiving some chats online. Okay, not from us. I want to be sure that I'm carrying everybody along. So there are in the components in the COSO internal control integrated from each component at its own principles. There are 17 principles in the COSO internal control integrated framework. So, but one of the components is control environment, which is the foundation for every other component. So when we treat COSO internal control integrated framework under the control under internal control in this syllabus, we still talk about this control environment. I may choose not to talk about it again, but that is how this CIA exam is. So now, under the control environment, we have these 5 principles. These are just the summary of the principles. There are 5 principles under control environment in the COSO internal control integrated framework. One deals with commitment to integrity and ethical values. And it says that the organization is expected to establish and reinforce standards of conduct promoting integrity and ethical values. And that includes mechanisms such as codes of conduct and whistleblower programs. And what do we use this mechanism for? We use them to address ethics there to core values. I mean, the core values that we have oversight. If you remember when we started the discussions on governance, board is also an aspect of governance that we discussed. And if you remember, when we started this we discussed extensively about the board and the role of the board. So we have one of the principles which speak to the independence and the oversight of the board. So the board is expected to maintain independence from management and actively oversees internal control. So the role of the board is to oversee the design, the deployment, the implementation, the performance of internal control. Please don't miss that aspect. The role of the board is to oversee the development, the design, the deployment, the implementation, and the execution of adequate and effective internal control within the organization. So finally, on that, effective governance ensures accountability and alignment with organizational goals and objectives. We have said this many times in our class. The other principle is structure, authority, and responsibility. So, management has a responsibility. The board also has a responsibility. So, the management now, under the oversight of the board, defines clear reporting lines. The management, under the oversight of the board, defines clear responsibilities and delegates authority matrix. So if you design your organizational structure well, it should ensure accountability. And the result will be effective and efficient decision making practices within the organization. And the third aspect of the principle under control environment is commitment to competence. Remember, in our class, we discussed, I think we defined competence as knowledge, skills, and other abilities according to the GIAS glossary. So, the entity, according to the Coastal Internal Control Integrated Framework 2013, the entity is expected to attract, develop, and retain employees whose knowledge, skills, and other abilities align with the goals and objectives of the organization. I always said to a candidate that the majority of the things we have in internal control are beyond internal auditing. Apart from independent, objective assurance, advice, insight, and foresight, the majority of the aspect of internal control that contributes to organizational success are aspects of the governance responsibility and management responsibility. So, what we are saying under commitment to competence is that if you cannot attract, develop, and retain people who have this knowledge, skills, and other abilities to achieve the organization's objectives, the result will likely be organizational failure, I mean. And is an aspect of control environment, because the incompetent people will do incompetent work, and they will give you incompetent unexpected or unwholesome results. So this is where we expect robust HR practices. For example, training, performance evaluations, to ensure that the personnel can effectively perform their internal control responsibility as expected. Finally, accountability. There's no way you talk about governance than you talk about accountability, because accountability is one of the initiatives of governance and they overlap with other initiatives. So finally, the key characteristics and impacts of control environment on the organization. One, cultural influence. We can also think about aspect of dynamic integrations, governance emphasis, and things like that. But cultural influence shapes the organization's tone at the top. It affects risk tolerance, compliance, and employee behavior. For example, a weak control environment will undermine other components within the internal control framework. No matter how you design the other components, whether it is control activities, risk assessment, information and communication, monitoring activities, regardless of how adequately they have been designed, a weak control environment will still undermine them. So, control environment also interacts with other causal components. I've been mentioning it: risk assessment, control activities, communication and information and communication, monitoring activities, and things like that. So, for example, now risk assessment reflects management risk appetite. And the risk appetite is actually influenced by the control environment. Remember when we discussed the relationship and the similarities between governance, risk management, and internal control. Another thing that you also I mentioned earlier is governance emphasis. The COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework 2015 highlights the role of the board in the oversight of organizational performance and activities. It also speaks about ethical leadership. And the conclusion of the whole matter is that governance aligns with internal control and also aligns with strategic objectives, because the purpose of internal control, risk management, and governance is to achieve organizations' objectives. That is it. So, in summary, now, the organization's control environment establish the ethical and operational foundation for effective internal control system. It fosters a culture where controls are recognized, where controls are respected, and where controls are implemented and also integrated into every aspect of the organization, every activities of the organization. And we should think about why why are we talking about control environment? Why does control environment matters? We have said it over and over that it establishes the overall attitude, behavior, norm, standard, assumption of the organization toward achievement of the objectives of internal control, towards the achievement of the purpose of risk management, towards the achievement of compliance requirements. So the control environment serve as the bedrock for effective organizational practices and also operational discipline and effective and adequate organizational structure according to the definition of our control environment. So it is the foundation for effective risk management. It is the foundation for effective governance. It is the foundation for adequate and effective internal control. And that is the reason why, as an internal auditor, we have a responsibility. Don't forget your role to assess whether, for example, the board and the management foster a culture where controls are respected, controls are recognized, they are developed, they are integrated, and they are executed as intended. Whether the board and the senior management foster a culture where ethical behavior is prioritized. Assess whether the board and the senior management enforce accountability. Those are the ways that CIA questions will come. But the most important thing for us is to first understand all of the theoretical principles. Then we now use practice questions to establish what we thought we understand. Like I said, don't worry. Like I always say, don't worry. You will understand it, all of this, when we treat questions, but not for today. Now, let's talk about some key components, the key points for internal auditors to understand in the control environment according to the 2017 IPPF. I have spoken about some majority of these. I'm just going to mention them quickly. Um, Tone at the top. As an internal auditor, we should focus on the attitude and actions of the board and management toward internal control. The board and the management commitment to internal control sets the organizational culture and organizational priorities. The other aspect is elements, the core elements to assess. What do? We evaluate the organization's code of conduct, business code of conduct, ethical guidelines, and mechanism to reinforce integrity. For example, whistleblower channels. That is aspect of assessment. So you cannot tell me you don't know area of internal auditors assessment in governance based on these key points that we have. But it can take time before we can all remember. Another aspect is management philosophy and operating style. What can we do there? We assess how management balance risk taking with control. For example, risk appetite, decision making process, things like that. Then another area, organizational structure. We have a responsibility to review if needed. We can review clarity of reporting lines, the clarity of reporting lines, clarity of delegation, clarity of coordination across organizational structures such as functions, departments, or unit or business division. So another aspect we can also talk about, which is a assignment of authority and responsibility. As internal auditors, we can verify that roles and responsibilities are clearly defined, documented, and that they are aligned with organizational objectives. Another aspect we can also talk about is human resource policies and practices. We can also examine hiring, training, performance management, and disciplinary processes to ensure they support control expectations. And finally, on that, competence of personnel. We also have a responsibility to determine if staff have the competence, knowledge, skills, and abilities to fulfill their control responsibility. And that is the reason why people need training on internal controls. Most people that have said they understand internal control have not gone through training on internal control. We only have a brief or a limited knowledge about internal control. And that is the reason why internal control is another aspect of the CIA exam that is challenging. Because most times in practice, we didn't learn internal control. We understand internal control based on what we meant maybe in our professional lives, in our careers, based on our experience, but we didn't learn internal control as a single course in most cases. And that is what makes internal control questions to be challenging in the CIA exam. And that's what I always tell people. Internal control topic questions are most times challenging. So finally, again, purpose of control environment. Control environment provides the discipline and structure for achieving internal control objectives. For example, operations objectives, reporting objectives, and compliance objectives. What do you need to consider as an internal auditor practically? What do you need to consider under this control environment matter? For example, you can check if the stated core values or policies, for example, ethics, are consistently applied or practiced by members of the organization. You can also identify gaps. For example, there can be a difference between management words and actions or operational realities. That is also possible. You can also think about the impact. For example, what is the impact of weak internal control? I mean, weak impact of internal control environment, which we know that it can undermine the entire internal control system of the organization. Let's move on. Organizations' cultures impact on the control environment and internal audit engagement. Organizations' cultures impact on the control environment and internal audit engagement. Let's talk about the influence on the control environment. Based on all the things that we have spoken about so far, culture directly shapes the effectiveness of the control environment. And the control environment, we know that it comprises or consists of governance matters, structure matters, ethics matter, disciplinary matters, which are set by the leadership. So now, integrity and ethical value. For example, a culture that prioritizes ethics will reinforce effective internal control. For example, transparent reporting. But a toxic culture may normalize unethical practices, and this will affect how we do our job. It will affect our planning, it will affect our performance, and it will affect the reporting of the result of the work we do. Um, Another aspect is management philosophy and operating style. For example, in a risk averse culture, which may also enforce strict controls. But if you find yourself in a culture of growth at all costs, that kind of culture might incentivize circumventing controls. Management can easily override approval processes to achieve the growth or the profit that they have planned. Organizational structure and uh, organizational structure and accountability. In an hierarchical culture, can find that authority will be centralized. That could also create bottlenecks. For example, you need access to something as an internal auditor to perform your audit. In an hierarchical culture where decisions are centralized or authority are centralized, that may create bottlenecks too for how you perform your audit. Also, in a decentralized environment, accountability may be less relevant too. Competence of employee and also compliance. If we train employees, if the organization is training focused, then there's high likelihood that people will follow the designed and implemented control. But if people are not trained, then we may find ourselves in a situation of non-compliance. What I'm saying is that non-compliance could be pervasive in that environment. Impact on internal audit engagement, risk, and controls. Now, This is another aspect of the syllabus that is also very important and practical. In an higher inherent audit risk now, higher inherent risk, what we should think about is that if the culture is weak, the risk of fraud will also increase. That is why. Risk of non-compliance will also increase. That is two. Risk of operational failures will also increase. For example, employees may skip documentation due to lacks of oversight of what they do. Now, another aspect that we can also talk about is control effectiveness. Although, and if you remember, I have said it in one of our classes that if something is not designed adequately, it is unlikely that it will work effectively. So, as a principle, internal auditors, we chose not to we chose not to continue with assessing the effectiveness of internal control, since we found the control designed not to be adequate. What we are saying here is that we could have a situation whereby controls are designed formally, implemented formally, but they still fail to address the risk that they were intended to address if the culture discourages conformance or adherence. That is one aspect. And we can talk about so many other matters, but let us quickly talk about example. We have a scenario where a scenario here, a company prioritizes aggressive sales growth. What is the cultural impact? Employees bypass credit checks to close risks, violating approval controls. Audit risks now: revenue overstatement, bad debt write-offs, and compliance breaches. And there's high likelihood that internal auditors may also miss those audit risks. What are we supposed to do as internal auditors? We can test override logs and customer contracts for unapproved terms, recommend realign incentives to balance growth and risk management and things like that. But the key takeaways in all of this, is that organizational culture acts as the invisible foundation of the control environment. So, a strong ethical culture will reduce audit risk by ensuring that people respect controls. A weak culture will undermine such requirements. So, as an internal auditor, we have a responsibility to assess cultural dynamics and to tailor our audit engagement effectively to those cultural dynamics so that we can be able to foster meaningful organizational improvement. Let's move on. So, in one way or the other, I have spoken about engagement risk or control risk in the previous discussion. The first thing you must understand is that engagement risk and controls are critical concepts in internal auditing and also risk management. Most especially when we talk about the provision of assurance services, you remember where we want to boost stakeholders' confidence on a particular matter. So, by definition, engagement risk refer to the potential threat or uncertainties that could compromise the achievement of engagement objectives. I can also say a risk, the potential effect of certain risk on our engagement objectives, most especially for a specific objectives. Our engagement risk is the possibility that we will not achieve, the possibility that we might not achieve our engagement objectives or the purpose of the engagement, which is the same thing as engagement objective. So the engagement risk in internal auditing is the risk that an internal audit engagement may not achieve its objectives. And that risk may lead to incorrect conclusion or incorrect engagement conclusion. It may lead to ineffective recommendations or agreed action plans to resolve the underlying issues, and it could result into reputational damage for internal auditors. So we have so many other risks that we can find in what do we call it, engagement risk, inherent risk, control risk, reputational risk, compliance risk, resource risk. Inherent risk is the risk that errors or fraud exist in the area being audited, which is independent of the audit process. That fraud is there, that error is there, but our audit process will not capture it. It's already there, but we may not find it because of the risk that we may not achieve our objective. Control risk, the risk that internal control, may not prevent or detect errors or fraud. The risk that internal controls designed and implemented may not detect or prevent that error, irregularities, or fraud or non-compliance. Detection risk. Detection risk is the risk that the internal audit procedures fail to detect material misstatements or errors or weaknesses or irregularities or fraud. The audit procedures used may not detect the significant errors, the significant weaknesses, the significant irregularities that is inherent in that process or in activity we are auditing. Reputational risk. The risk that our audit findings, remember, sometimes we call it observations, our audit findings or the process itself could harm our credibility as an internal auditor. The harm could harm the credibility of our profession, could harm the credibility of our organization. So it is the risk that the internal audit procedures fail to harm. It is the risk that the internal audit findings or the audit process may damage our own credibility or the organization's credibility. Now, compliance risk. The risk that the risk of failing to adhere to laws, regulations, or internal policies during the audit process. And that is the reason for due professional care. And that is why we say in due professional care that you should also consider laws, regulations, standards that is expected in that activity that you are auditing. That is why deep professional care also requires us to understand the internal audit policies, the organizational policies that relates to that relates to that activity we are reviewing or assessing. So you can see how all of these are linking to one another in a CIA context. Then resource risk, for example, competencies. The people that are auditing that entity or that activity may lack the knowledge, skills, and abilities to achieve quality audit. So the risk that the internal audit team, that is internal, you remember competency principle in the domain 2, ethics and professionalism domain of the new GIS. So the risk that the internal audit team may be incompetent, the risk that the internal audit team lack the resources to conduct a thorough audit. Maybe we may decide to give a limited assurance on the matter due to that kind of thing. So let us move on. Engagement controls. When we talk about engagement controls in internal auditing, it is about the policies, the processes, the procedures, the practices that has been established within the internal audit function to ensure that we perform the internal audit engagement effectively, efficiently, and in accordance with our professional standards. For example, the global internal audit standards, or if there's any other professional standards that is required for that audit. So when you talk about procedures, policies, processes, actions that the CAE has established to manage engagement risk, don't forget that we use control to manage identified risk. So the policies, the procedures, the actions, the practices that the chief audit executive has established within the internal audit department to manage the engagement risk, to ensure that our engagement process is effective, efficient, and is reliable to achieve the internal audit responsibilities or the internal audit mandate, is what we call the engagement controls. So we use the controls to manage risk, to manage engagement risk. We use the engagement controls to maintain audit quality. And we use engagement control to achieve our engagement purpose or engagement objectives. So we can see some examples based on this: planning controls, execution controls, and the likes. Testing controls, reporting controls. These are just general examples that we can see in practice. These are just general that we can see. Defining the audit scope, objectives, and criteria. When you go to the standards, there's a standard on this. There are requirements about this. So what do? I always say CAE that what we just need is to domesticate the requirement of the standards as a policy, as a procedure, as a practice of our internal audit department. That is it. So conducting a risk assessment to focus on high risk areas is part of the requirement of the standards, because we're expected to conduct a risk assessment to prioritize areas that we want to audit, because we cannot audit everything. It's also an aspect of due professional care. Don't forget. So when you look at all of this example, so that we don't waste our time, it's what we will share the when we share the presentation document. You will see it we can read it and establish it. And by the time we also read the actual review material, I think, and we test ourselves, all of this should be easily established. Okay. Reporting controls, ensuring audit findings are supported by sufficient and appropriate evidence. All of these are part of our standards. And remember, I always tell you, but when you read the standard, you may not know that this is a engagement control. But all of these are already part of the global internal audit standards. And I always tell you that you need to read the GIS very well to pass the CIA exam. You need to read and understand it very well to pass the CIA exam. So the key takeaway from all of these examples and this description is that the engagement controls are the safeguards, the measures in place, the measures in place in form of policies, procedures, practices, and actions to prevent or address those engagement risks that we discussed earlier. So effective engagement controls ensure the audit delivers accurately, ensure the audit delivers actionable insights, recommendations, and help us to maintain trust in the work of internal auditors, or help us to maintain our own credibility as internal audit professionals. Impact of organization, that is the impact of the organization's decision-making processes on the organization's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. The first thing that we must recall from the explanation so far is that recall that we had a session on where we were using the online test prep to test ourselves. And that question was we saw an aspect of decision-making processes as aspect of governance. Don't forget, I said in the class that time that I'm going to add the governance, internal audit governance responsibilities based on the 2017 version of the IPPF into our class document. I'm going to add it because, like I said in the class, we couldn't find specific responsibility for internal auditors in the new GIS. That's my own view. We couldn't find the specific responsibility for internal audit, specific responsibility for governance in the new GIS. What we found, recall that we found understanding governance, risk management, and control is what we found under the constitution for implementation. So the decision-making process of any organization will influence governance, risk management, and control processes. The decision-making process will also shape how effectively the organization will achieve objectives, which is aspect of governance. Mitigate risk, also an aspect of risk management, and also we found it in initiatives in governance. And finally, don't forget accountability. It will also shape how we maintain accountability within the organization. So we look at impact on governance, impact on risk management, and also impact on control processes. So on governance, effective decision making will ensure alignment with organizations' goals, objectives, ethical standards, core values, which will foster accountability and transparency. Remember, accountability and transparency is also an aspect of the aspect in the principles of governance that we did last week. Don't forget. So If you have a poorly structured decisions, what will you get? For example, autocratic, only one man, only one man. I've been in a I've been in a I've been in an environment where only the MD decides, regardless of whatever you say. Whatever he says is the final. The MD will not see reason in other management, other considerations. But the entity failed at the end. So we can talk about autocratic decision making or siloed choices. All of this can undermine the organization's governance because at the end, the employee may select or elect to prioritize short-term gains. Even the leader too may prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability of the organization. And that is. So what we expect is that since we aspects of governance includes leadership among stakeholders, we expect, for example, the board to involve other stakeholders in key decisions making. So we're expecting diverse perspectives to be considered before reaching a decisive decision on a significant matter. Now, accountability and oversight. Don't forget that oversight is an aspect of governance that is very important to internal auditing based on our class. So, if you have a clear decision-making rules, who has authority to decide this? Who has authority to decide? Levels of authority. Then the governance framework will be reinforced, continuously reinforced, that this is how we do it. At this level, this is the level that you can, this is the amount that this level of management can authorize for a contract or a procurement activity. So, what about if there is ambiguity? What about if the decision-making right is not clear enough? You will expect a lot of different imbalances in power. Some other people's actions may not be even checked because they can do anyhow in Nigerian parlance. If you decentralize decision making, what will you get? Although we know centralization has its own negative aspect, but decentralization also has its own problem. You decentralize without oversight on those decisions that you have decentralized. So people may just do what they like. They may act outside the policy. They may act outside expectations. So looking at the impact on risk management, risk identification and risk appetite. Like I always say, there are a lot of confusion in the difference between risk identification and risk assessment. Although in COSO we have a risk identification and risk assessment, but I always prefer ISO 31018 that defines risk assessment as risk identification plus risk analysis plus risk evaluation. That's another story for another date. So, if we have an inclusive data-driven decision-making process, we should expect an improvement in the organization's risk awareness. And if they are aware with significant risk facing the organization's strategic objectives. Then the decision maker will be able to align their decision with the organization's risk appetite or risk tolerance and things like that. But if the culture is reactive in nature, then what do you expect? People may overlook the significant risk in pursuit of instant or short-term gain. Risk mitigation. Risk mitigation. Um, if we have, we spoke about structure as an element of control environment. So if based on the organizational chart or structure, if you have a structured decision making that considers risk or the result of risk assessment before making the decision, then what do we expect? We expect an appropriately managed risk management environment. But if you have poor processes, poor risk management processes too, there will be poor internal controls too. For example, you may decide to skip due diligence acquisition because you are rushing to make decisions. Then you can find yourself in compliance risk, financial risk, and things like that. Those are the possible scenarios that could occur if you rushed such important matter as mergers and acquisition. And that is the mistake of investors too. In most cases, I've worked in organizations where we do eligibility, we call it eligibility decisions, due diligence assessment or things like that. What we are doing is, as a third party, what are the other party trying to know? They are trying to do the right thing before making decisions, whether they can give credit or whether they can acquire such organization and things like that. Now let's look at internal control aspect. Impact of organization's decision-making processes on governance, risk management, and control processes. So it will affect design and implementation of internal control. That is normal. So we can think about resource allocation and priorities. We can talk about where controls are prioritized, established, or will be functioning. For example, you can decide to invest in automated controls instead of manual checks. So it will affect the design and implementation of specific controls. Another example, we can decide to centralize our procurement process. But don't forget the bottlenecks that may be created by over centralization. Then operational effectiveness. Yeah. We can talk about consistent documented decision making, which is expected to reinforce control adherence. Fine. But the key word here is to talk about the example. Managements may choose to override IT security protocols for their own convenience. But there will be a result, and the result will be a weakened cybersecurity control. So when you look at these key connections, decision-making traits, transparent and inclusive, this and this, an aspect of governance, you will understand more. But I just want to look at this example. A retail company adopts a collaborative decision making process for inventory management. Governance aspect, cross-functional input ensures decisions align with sustainability goals. Risk management, risk like overstocking or shortages are proactively addressed. Control processes, automated reorder triggers are implemented based on data-driven. So at every point in organizational life, there will always be decision will also always have effect in each component of the organization. So this is the second aspect. The second aspect are in two places. One is about ethical and compliance related issues in organizations. The other is our role. Then we created a descriptive um, slides for us to understand organizational maturity. That is all. Now, ethical and compliance related issues. When we say issues, we know there are problems. So, and I believe based on these examples that you can see here, there are the things that we already know. There are issues, regular issues that we have in our organizations. So, ethical and compliance issues or challenges arises when our organization fail to align actions, behaviors, attitudes, practices, beliefs, assumptions, norms with legal standards, with societal norms or expectations, with internal values, such as our own core values. And the result will be a damage to our organization's reputation. And it can also trigger legal or regulatory penalties or sanctions. And when things like this happens, you can also expect loss of trust by stakeholders who will trust such organizations who has failed to align its norms, its practices, its behaviors, its attitudes, its culture, its assumptions, its operating philosophy or operating style, management philosophy and operating style with regulatory and legal standards, with societal expectation or norms, with internal corporate core values. So when you look at all of these examples, conflict of interest, a manager awarding contracts to a family member's company, fraud and corruption, falsifying financial statement to meet targets. These are all the issues that you will find in practice. So we don't have to bother ourselves on them. Environmental and social harm, example, ignoring emission standards or unsafe labor practices in supply. All of these defines or talks about the culture that we have tried to learn today. Then we can also look at legal and compliance requirements as an aspect of ethical and compliance related issues in organizations. So here we expect organization to conform or to comply or to adhere to general regulations and also to internal policies and also with industry specific rules. These are just example. Anti-corruption laws. We have Foreign Corruption Corrupt Practice Act (FCPA) in US, UK Bribery Act, Data Protection, the EU GDPR, the California CCPA, and so on. Labor laws, Fair Labor Standards Act, Workplace Safety, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. All of these are based in US. So we have our own in our own environment or countries. We should just have that understanding that organizations are expected to comply with legal and or legislative or regulatory requirements. Industry specific rules. Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the US, SOX, Basel, the Basel 3, Basel Accord in the banking industry, healthcare, patient privacy, anti-kickback statute, manufacturing, environmental regulation, EPA standard, things like that. These are examples of when you talk about the issues and what are expected of organization. They internally business code of conduct, anti-harassment policies, procurement guidelines and policies, things like that are general idea that internal auditors you have about ethical and compliance related issues in organizations. So, what are we supposed to do? We have a critical role in improving or fostering ethical behavior and ensuring compliance by, I've told you in our classes, when you see ensure in CIA questions, look at the intended action. If it is actually part of internal audit responsibility according to the definition of internal auditing and the purpose of internal auditing. So, internal auditors play crucial role in improving ethical behavior and ensuring compliance with laws, regulations, standards, and the likes by providing independent, objective assurance, advice, insight, and foresight. Don't forget, they are still the same thing that we have been talking about over time. So, and it's been a long time that I've checked our WhatsApp chats to see what is actually happening there. But I'm guessing I am still online. Am I still online? Because I have to switch or move from one tab to the other. It is not it is not comfortable or convenient, but we are trying. And I hope viewers later will find this engagement, this discussion useful in the long run. So, and there's another thing that I want to also see. I want to look at how many people I still have talking in the how many people I still have online. I can't see you. I can't see the people that I have online currently. I don't know why, but okay, I can see 13. I can see 13. I still have 13 people that are still online, and I've spent about 1 hour 32 minutes. I'll come back and cut all the beginning matters. I'll come back and cut them away. So I still have 13 people that are still watching. So thank you very much for coming. So this has just various examples of the roles of internal auditors auditing in the ethical framework of organization. So there are the things that in one way or other we have said, but it is very important for CI candidates to watch something. And what I think you should watch here is here. Now, look at this. This action, the actual action that we perform. Look at the keyword very well. It is very important. Evaluate, review, verify, identify, use, ensure. But look at what the ensure means at the end. Determine, escalate, advocate, track, audit. Now, let's just talk about a few of them. We can audit ethical programs by evaluating the effectiveness of code of conduct, whistleblower mechanisms, and ethics training. We can. Our role. according to the definition of internal auditing, and also um, the purpose of internal auditing. We can review whether leadership models ethical behavior. For example, we can review transparent decision making and accountability aspects of the organization. We can evaluate compliance control by verifying adherence to laws. For example, anti-money laundering checks can be a responsibility for internal auditor. We can verify adherence to internal policies. For example, we want to know whether the expense was approved. Fraud detection. Am I still there? Okay, I have moved. Yes. Fraud detection. We can use data analytics to flag anomalies, irregularities that has been conducted by somebody. For example, we can use data analytics to detect duplicate payments. We can use uh, data analytics to detect unauthorized access to systems or information technology infrastructure. We can also be given the responsibility to investigate misconduct. Although this is not good because of the issue, this may not be good enough for us because of the issues of independence and objectivity. But we can be given the responsibility, it depends on the organization, to ensure anonymous reporting channels are functional. It's like testing whether the control is working as intended. F- Are you with me? Under whistleblower support. We can also be involved in identifying root causes by determining system flaws, enabling unethical acts. The example I want to mention here, the actual example here is if you want to determine a certain system flaws that enable unethical acts. For example, lack of oversight in the consummated procurement activity. We can also be involved in promoting accountability. We can escalate ethical breaches and control failures to the board or the audit committees, or as required by our organization's policies and procedures or regulatory requirement. Because in some organization, in some industry, the regulators requires internal auditors to report certain uh, 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 irregularities directly to the regulators. So, recommending improvement, that is a general responsibility that internal auditors perform. We can advocate for stronger controls, uh, ethics training, advocate for ethics trainings for people to understand better and to be able to perform their internal control responsibility effectively. We can also recommend uh, updates to current policies if they are not if they are not update if they are not current again, or there are gaps based on our assessment. So we can recommend stronger control like segregation of duty, like rotation of key key people in financial position, or ensuring requiring organizational policy that relates to ensuring people go on leave during the year. So monitoring emerging risk, please watch those areas. They are not just that we are not just saying that our role is this and that, but you must actually look for the keyword that is important. So we can track updates to laws. For example, new ESG disclosure rules, regulations, standards. We can assess the readiness of our organization to all of these upcoming or new standards or regulations. So we also have our own impact as internal auditors, but our own impact on all of this. But this can be a discussion for another day. Don't worry. Organizational governance system maturity. I said this is here. Um, Now let's first talk about organizational governance system maturity. One of the things that I'm trying to do in our discussion is that I'm trying to bridge the gap between what I think internal auditors should know, or the information that should be readily available for internal auditors to understand the content of uh, CIA revision review materials. Sometimes I will note that some things are not properly defined or described. For us to better understand, those are the things I will focus on in our classes. The things that I think we will find in our books, or that have been described better in the books, I may not speak about those things. But this one, I want us to understand organizational governance system maturity, which refers to the degree to which our organization framework is structured, is consistent, and optimized to achieve the organization's strategic objectives, manage risk, and ensure accountability. So, organizational system maturity reflects how well an organization's governance framework is structured, the degree to which an organization's governance framework is structured, consistent, and optimized to achieve its objectives, to manage or mitigate significant risk, and to ensure or maintain or enforce accountability. So, generally, it reflects how well governance processes are integrated, how well governance processes are adaptive, and how well governance processes towards conforming with legal, legislative, regulatory requirements, meeting the expectations of the society, and enforcing accountability. So, how well these governance processes are integrated, adaptive, and aligned with the stakeholders' expectations, industry standards, regulatory requirements, legal requirements, and things like that. So, maturity is typically assessed across stages, ranging from ad hoc practices to fully institutional systems, which we see some examples of some levels of maturity. So, key dimensions of governance maturity. Now, understand this concept better. Policy and process formalization. In a low maturity environment, you will expect informal reactive governance with inconsistent rules. But in a high maturity environment, processes and policies will be documented, standardized, and and there will be proactive oversight of roles, responsibility, uh, authority, and decision making activity. Accountability and transparency. Now, in a low maturity environment, you will expect to find ambiguous rules, limited reporting, and opaque decision making. However, in high maturity environment, you expect clear rules. For example, board versus management roles, transparent disclosures, and measurable key performance indicators. Three, I'm sorry, that is not it. I need to go back one slide. Yes. Three, risk and compliance integration. In a low maturity environment, you should expect siloed risk management. That is, each department managing their own risk on their own without interaction with other levels, or the risk management activities is not enterprise wide. Everybody is managing their own risk. For example, people in the credit department will manage credit risk on their own. In the case of high maturity, we're expecting risk aware culture, compliance embedded in operations. It is already part of the system, and you expect real-time monitoring of activities, including internal control. So let us move far. Okay. Stakeholders engagement continue. So these are just examples of what happens in low maturity and high maturity environment. We can take our time with it, but I want us to look at this table, maturity levels common framework. So normally in practice, we can rate organizations, or we can use the criteria under each of this level to determine where an organization's maturity is on the maturity curve. So you can see initial, repeatable, defined, managed, optimized. Characteristics and example of such. For example, let's see in the initial, you expect ad hoc processes, reactive governance, minimal documentation. Example, decisions made inconsistently, no formal board oversight. But when you look at the highest level, which is optimized, you see something like predictive governance, continuous improvement, innovation in governance practices, AI-driven risk. Under risk example, we have AI-driven risk prediction tools, governance integrated with ESG goals as example. But what will you find in a mature governance system? As a form of example, what is the kind of practices that you expect? Let's say, for example, under this manage, we say the characteristics of this manage is data-driven decision, proactive risk management, and stakeholder alignment. Real-time dashboards for board oversight, ethics training are mandated. What are the other practices we can think of? For example, you should expect the organization to have board committees like audit committee, risk management committee, ESG committee. And these committees should be meeting periodically based on their former calendar or schedule or their terms of references. You can also think about whistleblower systems in such managed organization. Whistleblower systems, which is driven real time, driven by information, data, and things like that. So the conclusion of the whole matter here about maturity is that governance, as it relates to maturity, is the hallmark of organizational resilience. So organization can progress through one maturity levels to the other, and progressing from one maturity level can enhance the organization's ability to navigate complexity over time. It can improve The organization's ability to navigate it. I'm sorry, I have a system prompt that my system want to restart. Don't worry, I have said no. So it can also improve the organization's ability to navigate difficult situations. It can help foster trust. It can also help the organization to continue to operate in the long time, over a long period of time. So now, role of internal audit in low value. What are the role of internal auditing? These are just examples of what internal auditing will be doing in a low maturity governance systems and in a high maturity governance system. That is all. So the maturity of an organization's governance system will affect internal audit priorities. It will affect the scope of work, that is the job given to internal audit to do according to their charter. It will affect the responsibility of internal auditing. It will affect aspects such as independence and objectivity. It will affect the value of internal auditing. It will affect the quality of internal audit services. That is the first fact that we should first know. So these are just aspects of our role that we should all know. Let's look at characteristics for low maturity governance system. Characteristics of low maturity governance system now. So you will expect informal, reactive governance with weak policies. You will also expect siloed operations, inconsistent compliance, and minimal board oversight. That is a typical characteristic. But what will internal auditor focus on? Internal auditor will focus on foundational assurance and basic control implementation. That is where you will see in some organizations, internal auditors are responsible for internal control. That can define a low, that can be a definition of low maturity governance system, where internal auditors are also responsible for internal control. So our key activities could be identifying critical control gaps and recommending corrective actions, enforcing compliance, verifying adherence to regulatory requirements and basic policies, education. We could be involved in, education is an aspect of advisory services. Also, we can train management and staff on governance fundamentals. We can train them on risk assessment. We can train them on different risk management and control frameworks. We can also be involved in advocacy, pushing for formal governance process. For example, we can push for formal governance charters, that the board should establish board charters, establish audit committee charter, that the organization should establish risk management. So those are the things that risk management policies, procedures or programs. Those are the things that internal auditors can actually advocate for. But in the case of maturity, high maturity governance systems, the characteristics will be different. The challenges will also be different. I will still talk about an example here later. So, but let us look at the what do you call it? The high maturity first before we talk about at least one example about this. So, the characteristics now, we expect to have proactive, integrated governance with robust policies, real-time risk monitoring, and a strong ethical culture. The board and senior management are in alignment on strategic objective. supported by data driven decision making. What is our focus? Our focus will be on strategic advisory, optimization, and future focused risk management. So when more the things that we do evaluate how well governance adapt emerging risk, process optimization, recommend enhancement to automated controls, predictive analytics, things like that, alignment, audit alignment of governance with long-term goals, digital transformation, sustainability, ESG related matters. This is audit culture. You will remember that um, auditing culture is not a conventional audit. Now, one of the new things that internal auditors do. So we can assess whether values are embedded in current activities. For example, let's say your value is excellence, integrity, innovation, respect, things like that. Internal auditor can perform an engagement to assess those stated value. So I said I want to mention an example, a scenario here earlier on these low maturity. Let's say we have we have an organization that's just, let's say a startup, a small organization where we do not have formal approval. There is no formal approval or authorization policy or procedure or hierarchy. So internal auditors may be involved in designing uh, an authorization matrix to prevent unauthorized spending or overspending, because most spending are expected to be based on budget. So it is not that each of these will not have their own challenges. If you look at a low maturity governance system, you should expect resistance to change because their practices are informal and things like that. Now, can we move on now? And okay, but okay, maybe I should just think about another example of the high maturity governance system. You can find that in a multinational system, multinational organization. A multinational organization may have advanced and mature enterprise ERM program. What do you think internal auditors will be doing in that area, in that environment? Internal auditors might be the one in charge of auditing the effectiveness of technology areas like AI tools. For example, an organization may have AI tools that can predict regulatory changes. Or internal auditors may be auditing new areas in our audit balance, like ESG, and also culture. We may be auditing ESG reporting, the accuracy of the report based on some certain standards or on ESG criteria. Now, let's finish this up. So, after this example, I will conclude. Then we can go on our WhatsApp platform. I will start a WhatsApp voice note to have our private discussions since we cannot engage ourselves. And I just hope people are able to know some things they can ask me, but we can have that discussion on WhatsApp since we cannot engage ourselves on this live streaming platform. So key differences now: low versus high maturity governance system. You can see the aspect: primary internal audit role, risk focus, reporting, tools and methods. So For example, now in a low maturity governance environment, the role of internal audit is to build and enforce compliance. This is where our policing mentality came from, enforcing compliance. You do you remember? But in a high maturity governance environment, we become strategic advisor and innovation partner. Another area is area of risk focus. Our focus will be on mitigating. That's why mitigating risk is the most common used word in risk management strategy. Mitigation is the most used word. Everybody just say mitigation, mitigation. I always prefer to say, unless I understand that we want to reduce the likelihood or the impact of the risk, that's the reason why I'm using mitigation. So risk focus will be on mitigating basic operational and compliance risk. But in high maturity governance, you expect to find us addressing strategic, emerging, and systematic risk. Systemic risk, I mean. In the case of reporting aspect, we talk about gaps. Our audit results or findings are on gaps. That's why you find many internal auditors, they always mention gaps. But I always say uh, conclusion as used, audit engagement conclusion as used by the GIAS. So in the high maturity governance, you expect to find insight on governance agility and value creation. Tools and method that we use, manual testing. We use test checklists a lot. So conventional auditors will be looking for a lot of checklists. But in that environment, you expect us to be using data analytics, AI, predictive modeling, and so on. So when you look at all of this together, you will appreciate where we are coming from and where we are going in internal auditing. Because most of us started in this area, most of the environment most of us work in are here. So those are the things that we do that we thought that we know the full-fledged of internal auditing. And those things affect our decision making in CIA exams. Because we may think those things are correct rules of internal auditing. However, we have moved beyond those rules to the roles that actually reflects the maturity of the profession of internal auditing and even the organization maturity of the organizations that we work in. So in conclusion, in low maturity systems, internal auditors act as catalysts, activity that foster organizational foundational governance practices. So we focus more on implementation of control, designing control, and enforcing compliance. But in high maturity governance system, we become strategic partner. We drive innovation to create value, to sustain value, to protect value. Our value will continue to grow over time as the organization maturity of our company or the maturity of our organizational governance system matures. So when the organization governance system is maturing, our value will also increase. So we can shift from being reactive to issues, or from being reactive problem solving, error detector, fraud detector, thief catchers, to value adding function according to the purpose of internal auditing. Thank you very much for your time. I thank you for the time that you have spent. We have spent about 1 hour, 50 something minutes having the discussion. And I will go to, if you want to put your questions on the on the when we post this video recording on YouTube. If you have questions that you want to ask, you can put it in the comment section. I will find time to respond. But I will go to WhatsApp now to discuss with our CIA candidate. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate your patience because today has been another challenging day for us. So let us go and discuss what we did today, and we can find time to to do revisions on them using questions. Thank you very much. We can end this stream now.